It's super important for churches to be exceptional at welcoming people. But how is it that churches can do this? One thing that is really worthwhile is to develop a pathway of welcoming. This makes it clear for members of the Christian community to understand what they need to be attentive to at various times of interaction with new people. It also helps new people to understand how and where they can belong within the Christian community. We may like to think about these stages as entry points before the service, during the service, after the service, and of course, ongoing inclusion. Within this video, I have a special guest who shares considerations in creating the most welcoming physical entry points and waymaking. If you find value in the content of this video, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you aren't already receiving my weekly emails with exclusive content, webinar material, workbooks, and insights on how to help your church thrive by including, follow the instructions in the description section below and join our community. Emma Hanna is the missional community development worker at Manningham Uniting Church. Emma has a background in community development. Can you just tell us a little bit about what's happening at the moment for Manningham?
We've consolidated some of our physical assets and made use of that to make a missional plan for a new development of a church and community centre based in Templestowe. So it's been being constructed over the last 18 months to 2 years after 10 years in the planning. And we are imminently waiting for its opening.
And what's the philosophy that is guiding, like what is the intention with this building?
So the intention is to be able to provide a space that is safe and welcoming for everybody in the community. And it comes from the understanding that we are really blessed with the resources and acknowledge that that is a huge blessing and not every congregation has that blessing. And so we're blessed with this, the resources to create such a space. And we want it to be a space that is for everyone. So when we think about that, we think about it that this place is, it's God's place and we've created it from God's resources and we're just stewards of it. And God's resources and God's place is for everyone, whether you are a part of the church or not a part of the church. And so how is it that we facilitate that resource to be used and beneficial for everyone, keeping in mind that we want to be a part of creating and participating in God's love and liberation in the world. So we really want this place to, when you walk into it, you feel a sense that it is for you, regardless of where you come from, what you come with as you walk into the building, that you feel comfortable, that you feel welcome, that it's hospitable to you, that it's a place that you can learn, grow, offer what it is that you know in that space. And it's also a place where you can just be who you are and that's accepted. You can find connection and belonging.
When you're thinking about designing this building and you're thinking about the spaces, particularly the entry points, how people walk through the door, those sort of things, what are some of the been some of the thinking that's gone on behind that to ensure that this is a welcoming space?
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that we're still thinking about it as we, because we did a lot of considered and thoughtful planning in its actual design, and we did a lot of consultation with our local community in the public to really get a good understanding of what are the kind of spaces that the community would like to see. And so it's been designed with that in mind. So for example, one of the things that unanimously came back to us both through community support organisations, health organisations, the police, the public, was that there's no place in Manningham for young people to just be and hang out or where they're welcomed. And so we've created a youth space within the design. We've got a number of smaller and larger spaces that can be used for the community, for small community groups and larger community groups. So it's designed with that in mind. The frontage has a cafe that's to operate as a bit of a social enterprise that's going to support the training of young people, people with disabilities, refugees, all the like in hospitality, and be a real place that fosters welcoming and hospitality. And there are a number of entry points to the building, 3 or 4, I think. And so what we're really considering now that it's constructed and we can see what it looks like is, what do people see when they walk in that might help them identify that this is a place for them, that they're not entering into somebody else's space. So if you're someone who doesn't identify as part of the church or a part of the Christian faith or a part of any spiritual identity at all, then what does it look like to walk into that space? What is it that you visually see that would identify that this is a space for you, not that you're entering into somebody else's space? So you're not entering into, because I think sometimes you can walk into a space and if it's not a place that you have belonged to before or connected with before, then there might be visual things that immediately make you the outsider, that make it like it's designed for somebody else. So we're trying to keep in mind, what are the first things when you rock up to the building or when you enter into that building in that space, as well as what then? So you've walked in and then what? And so there's an array of things we're thinking about in relation to that, which is, I think, being deeply critical or having critical thought about what are the things that are culturally normal to us that might be barriers or foreign to other people that we might need to consider, but also what are just natural things that make a space feel homely and warm. So it might be the colour, it might be plants, it might be the smell of coffee or the smell of incense, or just all of those things that when you walk into a space, you're like, oh, this feels great. So how do we facilitate that?
Yeah, so I totally agree, because one of the things I've been saying for years is that whenever anybody, and this just doesn't apply to buildings, it can apply to outdoor spaces as well, because, if we're gathering as Christian community in outdoor spaces, we need to be attentive to the feel and everything that creates as well. But one of the things I've been saying for years is that the first stage in the process of somebody beginning to kind of join in with a group is that they walk in and they look around, no matter where it is, and they look around and see and ask themselves the question, can I belong here? They might not kind of consciously think about that, but in some ways they will be processing, is there a space here for me to belong? And we need to be really critically aware, are there kind of barriers to kind of easy entry points for people to look around and go, yes, I can belong here? Because we really want people to feel this sense that they can belong. One of the questions, I think, as you've been telling me this, I'm just curious, you've got 4 entry points to the building. Is it going to be clear to people which entry point they are going to go, like, be most welcome in? And is there an entry point that is going to be specifically, because you've talked about you need a space for youth, because that's what's lacking, for youth to just hang out in a particular space. So is there going to be an entry point that says, if you're a young person, this is the door you walk through?
Yeah. Look, to be honest, I don't know that we've got to the practical implications of that to this stage. And I think part of it is, it's one thing to look at a design on a piece of paper, and it's another thing to be in it and to actually walk into those different entry points, or to consider the different ways people might come to that space. What are the ways that we can make that welcoming to encourage people to walk through, so it doesn't seem like it's private property and you can't walk through there, but also that has elements of engagement that draws you into the story of the place. So there's a 60-metre long retaining wall along that walkway. So we're developing a community mural along that. And apart from just engaging an artist to do that, we're going to be running community focus groups where community can participate in the design elements, so that when they come, they can see something that they've been a part of creating along that wall. So that's one way. The other things we've thought about is, I don't know if you know about free libraries.
Yeah.
They've often around in the streets where people put like a cupboard, or there's all kinds of creative, people use like microwaves and all kinds of creative things at the front strip, and it's filled with books that you can just come and take or add to. So implementing some of those things that are around the entry points. So that's kind of on the outside. There's a children's playground at the front that will be clearly marked to say that it's not just for people who are participating in something in the centre, but you can come off the street and just play in the playground. So from the outside that way, but we also have an undercover car park. So the other entry point is a lift that takes you up, and then you come out pretty much in the middle of the centre. So it's a little bit of wayfinding once you get to the entry point and come in, and then what do you do? What do you see that might deliver you wayfinding? But what we also know is that wayfinding predominantly happens online. So we're in the place of really developing a really strong website where we have a very skilled website designer helping us with that, who we're really considering what it looks like to do wayfinding online. So one of the things that came up when we consulted with local government was that was one of the feedback that they said, because local government is responsible for wayfinding for public spaces. So you think about parks or the library or some of those big public spaces, and wayfinders often in terms of signage. So when you drive down the street, it says, public park this way or 5 kilometres or whatever. And what they've found in their wayfinding is that they've had to think more and more about how that same kind of wayfinding is implemented online, because people are going to Google where they're going to go, and they're going to know exactly where in that specific reserve they're going to go to and how they get to that by looking online. So keeping that in mind in terms of our online planning as an entry point. And then, but yeah, we're still, I think, doing a lot of development in terms of, okay, well, I've walked in the door, now what? And I think it's about asking the questions, if I'm 5 years old, what do I see? And what here tells me about what this place is about or where I could go? If I'm 90, what does this say? And what are the things that are important to me that I might want to know? As well as thinking about cultural diversity, but because we're a church, we're particularly focused. I mean, we want to welcome everybody, but we're particularly focused on engaging those who might be considered at the margins. So we need to think about, why are those people on the margins in the first place? So what exists that excludes them, that makes them out of the inner circle? And how can we intentionally make sure that this space communicates that it is a space for them, but in a really authentic way, not in a righteous kind of way, for want of a better word.
I think what you're talking about there in terms of right in a righteous way, it's about who owns the building, and what we want to try and do, if we're really wanting to be genuinely welcoming to the community and allowing this place to be utilised by the community, not just by the congregation, then we need to make space for those people to contribute, and make it not clear or not thrown in people's faces that this is not owned by them. One of the things that, because we went through a similar process 10 years ago when we built the building in Hampton Park where I was a minister, and we decided to call the building Uniting Place rather than calling it Hampton Park Uniting Church. Part of the reason for that was we wanted to, part of the reason is the church is not the building. And we keep on saying the church is not the building, the church is not the building. And then we name the building the church. It makes no sense because we undermine everything we say about the church is the people, not the building. And then we go and name the building so-and-so suburb church or St. John's Church, whichever way we do it, or St. Andrew's or whatever. So that undermines, but by calling it the name that we called it, Uniting Place, we were signifying that it wasn't, the church owned the building, but it wasn't like, we're being righteous about it. We own the building, therefore we are going to have the keys, therefore you need to come in on our terms. It's about getting that equality of power. Would you agree that's what you're aiming for?
Yeah, definitely. And it's about how do you welcome where you are self-aware enough that what you're offering isn't pity.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the things that I've learned a lot, I've been in this role with Manningham Uniting Church for, I think it's about 8 years. I did have 2 separate times off having babies. But in that time, I've spent a lot of time immersing myself amongst the congregation to understand who we are and what we're about and who are the gifts and skills and the passions and the deep sense of call of us as a people. And the same within our local community and encouraging our congregation to do the same and seeing where is it that those strengths come together to add value to one another. But it's also from coming to the point of view of saying, we as the church don't bring God to the community. God already exists in the community. And so sometimes what it asks of us is to humble ourselves, to be able to open ourselves to where God might already exist in the community without our involvement, and to either go and celebrate that and fan the flame and champion it, or get alongside it and collude with it. And so I think equally it's the same. It's really important and it's something we really need to focus on, and we're very aware of at Manningham Uniting Church, that just what you're saying, that the building isn't the church. So at the moment, because we're about to embark in it, it's taking a lot of our focus and our attention because we want to do it well, but we also need to make sure that we equally still remain participating outside of that building in the presence of God and the Spirit amongst our community, and keep that in balance so we don't lose sight. And I think it's the same as when we're considering the welcome element to people in the centre, is that those people who walk in the door have a lot to teach us about God, and have a lot to teach us about what God's welcome looks like. So we both have to be very rooted in what does Christian welcome look like, and how do we exude that so that people experience that when they interact with us and our facilities. But we also need to open ourselves to what might God teach me from that person walking in the door. And there's ample amount of stories of that in the Bible, right, where people are surprised that, how is it that I would be taught by that person that I thought was less than me or was outside of my inside group, or that they would be the teacher when I thought I was the teacher. So how do we keep that in a presence of mind as we interact and consider welcome generally?
Yeah, so I love hearing you talk about that because, to me, that's the basis of Christian ministry, right? That we're alongside people and we're collaborating at every opportunity when we can collaborate with people as mutual and equal partners, because there are huge opportunities. One of the expressions that I learned from one of my mentors, and I keep on repeating, is that God's resources are in God's community, and we need to get out there and work alongside people. Not thinking that we are the ones who bring God to people, exactly as you say, but it's also about learning from people, and we can learn from everybody as long as we're open about that. And the other thing too is that there are lots of people out there who can teach us how to be better disciples, even if they are not card-carrying Christians themselves. Like sometimes you get schooled by somebody, and it's like, I know they're not a Christian and they're behaving more like Jesus asked me to behave than I am, and they just schooled you, right? And you just got to recognize that. Can I just ask you, because yesterday when we were having a conversation, you shared with me a conversation you had with a librarian, and I thought, wow, that's really quite interesting, because it feeds into this whole conversation about welcoming, and particularly about entry points and spaces, and how people may actually feel when they walk into somewhere new.
Yeah. So I guess as we've been trying to learn about how do we create this space to be welcoming and conducive of belonging and participation, I thought about where is it in our community that those places already exist, or where we might have experienced a place where there is that real sense of welcome. And one of the few public places, I think, in community is the public library. And I think that when you walk into a public library, anyone who walks in has a sense of, this is my place, or a sense of ownership, or this is a place for me, regardless of your age, regardless of your cultural background, regardless of anything that you walk in the door with or as, or who you are. It is a genuine public space that is for everyone. And the other thing about libraries is that they've grown a lot in the past number of years, where they're not just about books or encyclopedias or studying. They're actually places for community to be and to be alongside of. And I often love going to the library just to work, because it's one of the few places where you get the full breadth of community in one space. And because I'm a community person, I just love being amongst community. I get a lot of energy and inspiration from that. And one of the things that you notice about a library is that there are a bunch of things that they offer that, they run English classes, conversation classes, they have Lego clubs, they have spaces that are set up for young people that have gaming, they have story times for children, they have magazine sections, they have the breadth of it. And so it occurred to me, what is it that they do that creates that place to feel like that? So what I discovered was that most libraries now have what they call a community outreach worker, or a variation of that title. And that's because they're particularly focused on how do they generate outreach or connection to community that's beyond books, but in line with libraries, I guess. So, and also because what they found was that many people were coming into the library, and that the predominant role that the librarian was playing was around that social connection point. So it was about somebody coming in who just wanted to have a chat, or just wanted to connect with another human being, or share what was going on for them, or just be in a place where they could communicate with someone else. And so they had to equip their librarians to be able to respond to that. And one of the things when I was talking to the librarian, this community outreach librarian, was to say, we're considering this new church and community centre, and how we can create it to be a similar space to a library where you can walk in and feel like it's for me. And one of the things that she talked about was that she wouldn't necessarily know that this place was a place for her as someone personally who didn't identify as part of the Christian faith, or as a part of any particular spiritual faith or any denomination, that her perception was that potentially it would be disrespectful for her to come to this place, because it was a place for people who identified as Christian. So not necessarily because she felt that a church was a place she really didn't like, or that she didn't want to go to, but that she felt that for her, she would be disrespecting the people who owned it or the people who had created it because she didn't identify as part of the Christian faith.
So as a librarian and somebody who is not coming from a faith background, she is suggesting that that she would feel as an outsider if she went into a building that was kind of owned by a congregation. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, because I think that there was a perception that it was like a sacred space and that she would be dishonoring that sacred space to walk into it because it didn't have the same sacredness for her. So it was interesting to me because that was her perception as the outset. So then it was to say, well, she's not even coming. Not because she's not open to coming or because she's against it or she has any kind of problem with a church or a Christian community, but just because from the outset she didn't think it was a place that she could come to. So what do we do with that to change that narrative or that message so that other people who might have that perception might see that differently? Secondly,
there's another factor there that I think is really important, and that is that if people don't know, they err on the side of caution because nobody wants to embarrass somebody. Like that is something that within our society, we really don't want to be put in the situation where our actions embarrass somebody else. So what you're talking about, I think what she's kind of articulating in a way is that she doesn't want to put herself in a position where she's making other people feel uncomfortable by her entering that building, which is really interesting, isn't it? Because as Christians, we wouldn't think that, and we wouldn't think somebody walks into our building, we are going to be embarrassed or offended by that. We want people to come in, and particularly what you're talking about with a community centre that you're building for Manningham.
And I think it was, and I think what was really interesting for me was because I think part of the assumption that we as Christians might also make it, well, the one assumption might be that everybody understands that anybody can come to a church and that of course the church is for everybody and of course you can just come off the street and walk into a church. Of course that's what you can do.
We've got the sign out the front. We've got the sign out the front that says all welcome, right? So
right.
It doesn't mean anything.
No, well, and I think it's about the alternative to that, or the other side of that is, and another assumption that we may have is that people may be reluctant to come in because they're fearful that they're going to be pounced upon, or they're going to be expected to become Christians, or they're going to be, Bible bashed, for another, better word. And so that's the other perception that, or assumption that we might hold, that is a barrier to people coming in. And so to hear this from her around, no, actually, I don't want to disrespect people. I had never considered that before. So it was very interesting to me. And when I said to her, well, I'm very conscious that you run a public library that is explicitly for everybody. And so the way that you set this place up physically, the way you are in the space has to exude that it is for everybody. So what are the factors that or that you've learned help that process that we could also consider as we try and replicate that to some extent in our space? And she talked about the importance of, one thing is when you walk into a space, the things that you see, that you can identify yourself in them, that speaks to you that this is a place for you, or this is a place that you are welcomed in or can be a part of, because you visually see something, you're like, oh, I identify as a part of that. So I guess what that said to me was that in those entry points, we really you have to have a really good understanding of the community, your local community, or whoever it is that you're wishing to engage in that space. And then you have to have a cultural awareness about what are the things that they would identify themselves in, and how do you make sure those things exist in those spaces. So whether it's having an understanding in terms of the different cultures within your community. And so, what are the languages that you might need to include in your signage? Or I think it's just about knowing your local community. Is it a community that is really invested in and values art, or is a real artist community? So how does your centre replicate that, or how does your spaces look really artistic, so that when someone walks in, they're like, I'm an artist, or I'm a part of the artist movement, or I love art, or I'm a part of this community because it's artistic. They walk into that space and they go, oh, here's art. I can identify that. Or even better, there's my art, or there's my friend's art, or, thinking about it in terms of that way. And I think that we can identify that ourselves as Christians, because there might be things that when we walk into our church spaces, that we deeply identify with because of our Christian faith, or because of our history, that we're like, this is a sacred space for me because of this. And it will be different for various people. We have to take that same understanding and think about it in the eyes of someone who has never experienced faith or comes from a completely different perspective.
Yeah, because symbols can carry very different meanings for different people.
Yeah.
For example, the Christian symbol of a cross. For Christians, we look at that and we go, well, Christ died on the cross. We understand what that means for us. We're Protestants. It's an empty cross. It's not a cross with Jesus still on it, because we're emphasising the resurrection. However, for other people who may not have that heritage, they might look at the cross and go, well, that reminds me of the things on the side of the road when somebody's had a car accident and died there. So, yeah, we need to be really quite cognizant of how symbols get interpreted, because symbols particularly get interpreted different ways by different people. So, yeah. So that is.
Or sometimes the people, and I think it comes back to who is this place for? And so if we are a people of faith, and if we're thinking about building, because we're talking about building in this instance, the building is for people of faith, yes. And we as Christians are called to meet those at the edges, or meet the diversity of God's people, Christian, interfaith, whatever. And so if that's who we're to engage, then everything that we do, including our physical artifacts, ought to reflect that. And so that's hard for us sometimes, I think, because we want to be able to say we're Christians, and that means that this is a place for everyone, and that means that we're followers of Christ, and that means that you will be loved here. But we also have to understand that the vast majority of the population haven't grown up with that understanding. Either have no understanding, or maybe some people have had the opposite experience of a Christian community or not. So some of those artifacts that we believe communicate one thing for us might actually communicate the opposite for the other person. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's more important? Because ultimately what we want is to engage with that person. That's the very reason, that's our very goal, is to engage with the person who feels marginalised. And sometimes that person's been marginalised by the church.
Yeah, absolutely. So it may not be a case of whether we have them or we don't have them. It may be more a case of where we actually place them.
Sure.
So within Uniting Place, those Christian symbols that were really important for the congregation were actually placed specifically in the worship sanctuary. The rest of the building did not have those symbols. We did a lot of work with collaborative work with the Islamic community. So we wanted to make sure that was a space that they felt comfortable in, and they weren't being excluded. So the symbols were intentionally placed in a different part of the building where they would move into, and there were we had some Islamic events. We had coffee with a Muslim happening within the church sanctuary, but the Islamic people moved in there after we had developed relationships of trust, and that they understood who we were, and they weren't threatened by the fact that we were Christian, and we weren't threatened by the fact that they were Muslim, and we could share space together. But that trust had been developed before we were asking them to move into a space where they weren't sure, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that's the really important, one of the important things to pick up there is relationship.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about creating a physical place that is welcoming, we definitely need to pay attention to physically what are the things in there that make it welcoming. But we also need to keep in mind that it's not a build it and they will come. It doesn't matter how fancy it is, how wonderfully designed, how you've consulted the community, whatever it is. Just because you've built this thing doesn't mean that people are going to come into it. And so the relationship piece is really important, and that is the bridge that creates the welcoming or the entry point. So, and I think it's as much of how we go out into the community and we go outside our comfort zones in order to develop the relationship. So at Manningham, knowing that we've spent a lot of time, particularly in the last 5 years in particular, considering the things that are happening in our community that in some way align with our values, and we've taken a posture of saying yes. We're just going to say yes to things, and we're going to show up, and we're going to have a go, and we're going to see what happens. And sometimes that's been really uncomfortable. It's been really outside our comfort zone. Other times it's things that we're familiar with. But unanimously what happens is that it's less about the thing we've said yes to, but what happens when we're there in the space, and who we meet and the connections we make, and then how that spurs off. And what happens is you develop those relationships. So the sense of welcome, or the sense that this could be a place for me, or a place that I could participate or contribute to, comes because people know who you are. They've had an interaction with you. So then the place is less off-putting because you know who's in it. So it's as much as what you do outside of the building that creates the entry point and welcome to the building as it is the building or the facility itself. It's both.
Yeah, and of course, so it's about mutuality and about trust. Thank you very much, Emma. That's been great to speak with you. I'm sure that lots of people will get lots out of this, particularly when they're thinking about the entry points into making sure that we have a welcoming space, and as people develop a pathway of welcome.